finally we come to the last era of Byzantine art that's normally covered by Byzantine art history. And it's that period from the sack of Constantinople by the Latins to the eventual conquest of the city by the Turks. Appropriately enough, this is usually known as the late Byzantine period. And just as that middle Byzantine period was, it started off as a period of experimentation and really ended as a period of consolidation, where the style was really homogenized and standardized. The late Byzantine period actually is more of a time of refinement than anything else. And with great irony, part of the factors leading to this refinement was the occupation of the city of Constantinople by the Franks. So as we covered in the last lecture, the city itself was sacked by the Venetians, but it was occupied predominantly by Franks. So this is known as the Frankish or Latin Empire, this period of almost a century of Latin occupation. Now, just like with the iconoclasm, just because the politics changes doesn't mean that art ceases to exist. The art just moved. So there were several centers all around the Balkans. I'm thinking of in Nicaea and also around the Black Sea that were rival centers of Byzantine culture that saw themselves as successors to Byzantium. And we do have art from these centers, really beautiful art in this period. But artists or artisans, they go where the projects are at. So as we talked about in last lecture, some of our best examples of Middle Byzantine art are the mosaics found throughout Sicily or Italy proper. So the Greek artisans were willing to travel where there was work. And in this late Byzantine period, this predominantly actually meant the Balkans. So some of our best examples of late Byzantine painting come from the Balkans. The reason for that is the Balkans at this time were emerging as military, economic, and also ecclesiastic centers of power. So there was a lot of building projects to be had. But there are shifts that happen because of the fall of, or the occupation of Constantinople and the move to the Balkans that actually influenced the style, the subsequent history of Byzantine sacred art. If we think back to all of the examples I showed of that Middle Byzantine period, we do have a preference for valuable materials, for sumptuous materials. Icons there are painted icons, but primarily there was this preference for carved ivory icons, for gold relief icons, for miniature mosaics. There's a jewel-like quality in that Middle Byzantine period because of the emergent wealth and the sophistication of the court that were, sponsoring and purchasing a lot of these items or using them as capital for diplomatic reasons. Is one of the major impetuses for developing the art. So they had a real preference for valuable and sumptuous material. But when the city is occupied and we don't have that wealth and we don't have that courtly life, there is a shift now that turns to the painted medium. If you recall in the last lecture as well, Middle Byzantine art was really focused on the art form of mosaic. And that is also true of the early Byzantine period. But mosaic was considered the ideal medium in which to decorate a church. After the Latin conquest, that really starts to change. Before that, fresco or wall painting, fresco or mural for that matter, was considered basically the cheaper alternative. That's what you did when you couldn't afford mosaic. But when, again, the capital is not there, you shift towards these other mediums. You shift towards painted panels. You shift towards frescoed churches. And what that does is it means because there's not more prestige art forms like mosaic, like ivory carving, like gold relief, the best artisans usually occupy that prestige medium. But as that medium is changing to painting, that means you have the best artists in the empire, in the tradition, working in the medium of painting. So what happens in the Balkans, it's like the whole tradition bottlenecks and starts to focus the aesthetic genius into this one medium. And what we get is this rapid refinement of the painted icon, of the painted style that happens in the Balkans in this late Byzantine period. So if you look at the Balkan painting, in the very earliest stage of this period, it looks very similar to the fresco painting that's happening in the late Middle Byzantine period. But that influence of the classics really comes to full flowering in this period. So again, just as we saw in the Middle Byzantine period, there's this shift away from the more decorative, the more pattern-oriented aspects of a medieval style, in incorporating into that now this more focus on classical balance and realizing a solidified form. That also we see that take place in the frescoes, and that tradition basically takes over that classical instinct. So we see, when we lay out these frescoes, a real progression from something that's medieval to something that's reviving that classical instinct, to where now the forms are more solidified. We have the reintroduction of contrapposto, and we have a real naturalism that comes into particularly the icon painting. So gone is this sort of elongated body proportions, and the faces too also become more naturalistic. So they're not becoming realistic. They're not trying to be photographic, but we do have a sense that we're looking at real people. And what's quite pronounced in this time period as well, as even though it's moving into more naturalism inspired by classical art, it doesn't lose any of the spirituality that was gained in that interim. So when we reflect back onto the Our Lady of Vladimir, that just intense spirituality of that face, or those other icons of the Middle Byzantine era where the face is just radiating and luminous, none of that is lost in these late Byzantine icons. We retain that monumentality, but there's a new grace to it, a new naturalism, but the spiritual depth is still there. And that's what makes this period so unique, and why it became so characteristic of the tradition as a whole. It's really from my opinion, the high watermark of the entire history of the Byzantine sacred art is right at this time. So when we look at these icons, again, they're charged with that spirituality, but they have a new naturalism that is unique to this period. So one example here is, these are actually mosaics in Hagia Sophia. They've been partially removed when the city was conquered by the Turks, but these mosaics, they strike me as very ancient, almost going back to the time of Justinian, but they're not. They were actually commissioned by the Paleologian emperors who retook the city. So oftentimes you will hear this period of Byzantine art history called the Paleologian Renaissance, because now we have a new dynasty of the emperors in the Paleologian family who retake the city and found a dynasty themselves that go all the way to the end of Byzantium. But these icons were commissioned right when the city was reconquered by the Greek forces, and this was part of the rededication of the cathedral of Hagia Sophia, of the great temple of wisdom. And when we look at these icons, again, now the capital's flowing in, they can actually execute these works in mosaic, but they're distinctively different from what came before in that Middle Byzantine period. Gone almost completely is that sort of static formalism that was already beginning to dissipate by the end of the period. They still have that tremendous monumentality, but there's a real naturalism to the faces that almost make them look antique, like early Roman mosaics. These are some of the most beautiful examples of all of Byzantine art. So that's what I'm getting at, is that, you know, none of the gains that were developed in that Middle Byzantine period were lost in this emergent naturalism. If anything, it only added to the aesthetic and the experience of encountering these icons. Another aspect of this art that I would draw your attention to is that there was also a refinement of the compositions of the icon themselves. So in that Middle Byzantine period, we had, at least in the early period, the compositions were more had to do with pattern, but as we saw, there was the slow reintroduction of natural balance and contrapposto, how you actually position the figures and how the different positioned figures interact with each other as a whole, how the composition works all together. And now all of that is much more conscious in the icon painters of the time. So we see this in the Balkan frescoes, but we also see this in the late Byzantine as the Greek Empire recovers in Constantinople. We see a dramatic shift in the quality of the compositions. Nothing is haphazard. Things don't necessarily at first, we'll get to this, at first feel cramped. It's not like you're trying to shove images into, you know, an area that, you know, might hold them. There is a real logic and foresight and balance to these compositions that make them so enduring. Even today, like as an iconographer, I continually look to these Paleologian prototypes to get my basic compositions, and that's how good these compositions actually are from just an artistic standpoint of just good design. So this all comes out of this Paleologian Renaissance that's been you know, reacquainted with the classical tradition. So as an example of what I'm speaking of this, you know, beautiful compositions, perhaps other than Ravenna in Italy, the greatest example, from my opinion, of Byzantine sacred art is the Chora Monastery of Constantinople. And Chora Monastery was, like many monastic foundations, was funded by, you know, a politician who had massive, you know, access to capital. And it was very common for emperors or other people in the courts or in the political sphere to found and patronize monastic foundations. And part of even the typicas of these monasteries, where they would pray for their founder and benefactor and patrons in perpetuity. So it was kind of a way to make sure that you are always prayed for as you know, go to meet your Lord and Judge, that there's a whole monastery that's praying for you. But what's unique about this monastery is the man who commissioned the monastery, over time he got poorer and poorer. I mean, not poor, you know, that's sort of relative. And eventually he died as a monk, as someone who, you know, had nothing left. He embraced holy poverty, and he actually died as a monk in the monastery that he set up, you know, to pray for his soul. So it's an interesting story, but art historically, what does this mean? Is it means that the monastery started with this very grand, very high-end decorative schema and medium of mosaic. But when we look at these mosaics, they're some of the most masterful compositions in the entire tradition. We have everything that's so unique and so special about late Byzantine art here. We have the beautiful composition, we have the naturalism, everything is sort of like contained in this one monument. But what makes this even more amazing is as the building projects you know, went along through time and capital became, you know, less easy to come by, the medium shifts away from mosaic and into fresco. You know, it's the cheaper alternative. But what's so amazing is the artistry keeps going up and up and up. So the frescoes, not only the mosaics, but the frescoes of Chora Monastery are by far the masterpieces of Byzantine frescoes. We don't actually know the name of the painter here, but they are absolute masterpieces. And oftentimes what's known as the great masterpiece of Byzantine fresco is actually the painting in the apse of the funerary chapel. So in the apse of most churches, of course, we have the Mother of God. That is the standard depiction there. But because this was a funeral chapel, we have sort of an atypical scene, and that's the scene of the Anastasis. In Byzantine art, we don't depict the resurrection of Christ because it's not depicted in Scripture. You may find icons of the resurrection of Christ, but they're sort of later imports from the West, from Western iconography. But instead, we either depict the myrrh-bearing women in the empty tomb, or we depict this scene, also known as the Howling of Hell, where Christ is descending into Sheol. And this is what's being depicted here. So he's descending into the netherworld, where the souls of the just and the souls of the damned are all there. And what's going on is he's breaking down the doors of death, the doors of Sheol, literally trampling down death. And to those in those tombs, which is all humanity, typified by Adam and Eve, he's raising them up to life. And all surrounding Christ in this anastasis, this undeathing. That's what anastasis means. We have all of the righteous of the Old Covenant, including the forerunner of Christ, John the Baptist. And you have the prophets, Daniel, and the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the holy monarchs of the Old Covenant. So here's David. And they're all there. They're all there receiving the evangelion, receiving the gospel of Christ, and being brought up with Christ into the heavenly reality. Before that, the afterlife was just one thing. It's just Sheol. But after that, that's really when we get, a distinction between the damned and the saved. So this is all going on in this beautiful fresco that's just rendered with such mastery. This is really the high watermark of Byzantine fresco painting. And interestingly enough, at this point, really the first time in the tradition, we actually know the names of the painters. So I just wanted to mention another one of the very significant painters who did a lot of work in the Balkans and a lot of work in the monasteries of Mount Athos is Manuel Pensalinus. Yeah, that's his name. And he's become increasingly important to the study of Byzantine icon painting, studying his technique, studying his proportions, studying his use of color. So he is seen by many iconographers. Particularly, I'm thinking of George Cordus, a contemporary iconographer and scholar of iconography working in Greece. He's seen as the greatest fresco painter, other than the master who painted the Anastasis. So again, in this time, we start to know the names of the artists, and we see the best artists, the entire artistic genius of the tradition is now being concentrated in painting, really for the first time. I mean, today we think of Byzantine icon as primarily as something that's painted, but that really wasn't always the case. That wasn't the case until the 13 and 1400s, where icon was almost now synonymous with painting. That's when that happens. It's in this late Byzantine period where we can't produce icons in those mediums that were more prestigious, perhaps beforehand. What's also amazing about this period is, just like in the Middle Byzantine period, the aesthetic principles and philosophy of this period was also being exported. And that's really quite amazing, because it wasn't a time of great political or economic flourishing for the empire. It was a period of decline, but the artistry was so good that the artistry was beginning to influence still those places beyond Constantinople. So a lot of historians kind of point that out, as the civilization is in decline, the artistry is just getting into a real flowering into sort of the classic expression of the Byzantine icon. There are two examples that I will mention of the influence of the Paleologian Renaissance. Oftentimes you'll hear it referred to as the Paleologian mannerism, and I'll get into what a mannerism is in a minute. But so this Paleologian aesthetic was transmitted to Russia. So as we left off with Russian icon painting, it did receive that early Byzantine aesthetic, but developed sort of its own aesthetic qualities in Novgorod and the tradition associated with Moscow. That was really rather different than the Byzantine aesthetic. But at this period, there was an attempt to bring the orthodoxy of the Rus more into a universal Orthodox consciousness. That led to interesting and aspects of liturgy, where the Russian liturgy had to be reformed. We don't really need to go into that. But what it also meant is we had a lot of Greek icon painters going into Moscow. And one of the most famous, I can never pronounce his name right, is Theophanes the Greek. And he brought a lot of this Hesychasm, or this Paleologian influence into Greece, but also a spiritual movement called Hesychasm that was also influencing the artistic style. So just as St. Simeon, the new theologian, and his doctrine of divine light was influencing icons, so too in late Byzantium, we had a resurgence of the idea of direct encounter with God. That was very popular within monastic circles, but at this point it also becomes popular outside of monastic circles, and it causes a great debate, like so many things do. And the saints associated with it in particular is our theologian of theologians, St. Gregory Palamas. But it's a movement that insists on the accessibility of God to the ordinary Christian. So this starts to influence the art as well. And we see that some of those aspects that we've already spoken of in the Middle Byzantine period are even more pronounced now. The divine light in the Middle Byzantine period was more focused on the gold and the sort of the radiant, soft highlighting of the faces. But in the late Byzantine period, it starts to become focused on the highlights. The highlights themselves are communicating the divine light. And we see that shift. A lot of scholars associate that shift with the influence of Hesychasm. And we see this very strongly with Theophanes the Greek, where he's really focusing on those highlights as an expression of Hesychast philosophy, Hesychast spirituality, rather. Now, Theophanes' greatest student, or at least he mentored him, was the great Andrei Rublev, who's he's canonized by the Church and is known as one of the greatest iconographers of all time. So again, in this period, we actually know the names of these iconographers. And Andrei Rublev, what he's actually doing in this period is he's bringing that Paleologian classical aesthetic into his Russian icon painting. So he doesn't paint like a Greek. He uses in iconography what we think of as a very wet style, a style that needs, washes of paint and works with a very loose a paint mixture that's very different than how the Greeks would work. Greeks would work on easels, and they would use dry paints and these kind of aggressive strokes with nice, blending, like Theophanes himself. But Rublev is painting in this very rich, very layered Russian style, but he's bringing that Paleologian aesthetic. He still has the elongated figures that come from that Middle Byzantine and that were really refined by Novgorod and the Muscovite tradition. So he's still, steeped and rooted in that tradition of Russian icon, but now he's bringing this classical Roman, Byzantine sensibility. So his figures became just extraordinarily beautifully composed, and his compositions are just beautifully balanced. But even beyond the composition or the balance, his faces do really bring that quintessential element of that late Byzantine period where they are radiating light. They're radiating light in the same way that those Middle Byzantine icons were, with the layering, but they're also radiating light because he's using that highlighting system that is now coming from Greece, influenced by Hesychasm. So we have this beautiful confluence of the best of the Paleologian encountering the best of the Russian tradition in this one figure, Andrei Rublev, which is why he becomes so important to the tradition of Russian icon painting. Now, the tradition is also going to Italy. We've already spoken about the Italio-Byzantine school, so icon painting was certainly very popular in Italy. People don't often realize this, but some of what caused the conflicts between the churches is that a great portion of Italy, not just Sicily, but Calabria, so southern Italy, and at one point the entire east, the entire eastern coast is what we would think of as Byzantine Christians. They're Christians of the Byzantine Rite. And slowly there was a Latinization of the Italian peninsula, and that led to tensions between the churches. But the history of Byzantine art in Italy is long and rich and complex. So there was always this open communication between Italy and what was going on in the capital. But this really picks up in this late Byzantine period, and a lot of why it picks up is political. The people in Constantinople, they keep losing territory to the Turks. The writings on the wall that the empire is not going to go on forever, and they really reach out to Italy, which they saw as their, sometimes they didn't get along, but as a sibling civilization, as Rome. It was Eastern and Western Rome. So we have diplomatic envoys that are sent to Italy, or ecclesiastic envoys. The attempted reunion Council of Florence is an example of this, where you had a huge delegation of Eastern churchmen and theologians and politicians came over to try to reconcile things, at least enough to get military support back in Constantinople. But what also happens is we have an influx of Eastern art into Italy, and this actually predates Florence, and we can actually document that art historically and archaeologically, which is fascinating. So the first, how should I say, the beginning of the Italian Renaissance, this rediscovery of classical civilization, really began with Byzantines coming over from Constantinople and bringing with them these classical literature, classical conventions to Italy. It was Byzantine scholars who brought over, Plutarch and Homer and, actual accurate Greek copies of Aristotle. The Latins didn't even have Aristotle in Greek. They had it in Arabic that they had to translate into Latin. So we have this tremendous influx of ancient Greco-Roman literature into Italy, but also artistic techniques. And we actually see that that whole deposit from Constantinople is reviving a classical interest in Italy that would blossom into what we know as the Italian Renaissance. And we see that in art history. So when we look at the early Italian Renaissance painters, they're all, without exception, icon painters. They even say so. Cimabue, which is one of the greatest of the early Italian Renaissance painters, he was trained by Greek masters. And when you look at his icons or his paintings, they are icons. They are late Byzantine, Italio-Byzantine icons. So that's where he's getting his artistic training. And they also brought over this re-emerged and refined tradition of fresco painting. So when we look at these early frescoes from the Italian Renaissance, even into Giotto, and you compare those with the fresco painting that's going on in Mount Athos or in Serbia, the link is directly clear. I mean, it doesn't get any more obvious. And we know that these early Italian Renaissance masters were learning from Greek artisans who were coming over from Italy, from Greece, or the Balkans. So this is very well documented. It's just not part of the story we necessarily hear about. It's because the later Renaissance was self-consciously moving away from the Greek style. But that initial deposit, it's very clear that it's coming from these Byzantine masters who are reviving this classicism, this desire to revive and match that classical antiquity. That's all coming from the East. So the story is grand, but it also is tragic. In in the actual, Aristotelian understanding of tragic. Tragedy is when you know the end of the story before it begins. So the end is always looming as this ever-present, possibility, and that's really, really exemplified or describes this entire period of Byzantine history. It's tragic. It is a great flowering of the intellectual life, a great flowering of spirituality with Hesychasm, a great flowering of the arts, but the writing is on the wall that the empire doesn't have a lot of time left. Envoy after envoy to the west doesn't materialize in anything like the military support needed to stop the Turks. City after city fall. The writing is on the wall, so to speak, and that does actually start to influence the Byzantine art of this period. So the art ends on somewhat of a melancholy note. One of the last monuments of Byzantine art we have is actually from the city of Mistra. Mistra was a city, a small little town in the Peloponnese, actually near Sparta. It was really the last holdout of the empire. And a lot of those great scholars of the empire and great artisans, and even the emperor himself, all wound up there after Thessaloniki fell and Constantinople fell, and the art that we get there's the last sort of glimpse of this late Byzantine period, but the art kind of takes a step back in a sense. The classical balance, the harmony of the composition, all that starts to decay, and we see a more cluttered, a more frenzied kind of composition. And a lot of scholars actually see in this art almost the anxiety of the civilizational decline. So these paintings can be very anxious. Their style can actually be rather garish. They're actually sometimes they're hard to engage with, and that last final anxious note is actually where the art after this period takes up. So right after the fall of Constantinople, when the Byzantine artistic tradition is still living, and we're going to cover the decline and the revival of the tradition in the next lecture, but we have this period of icon painting where the compositions are no longer refined, and things get more busy, more complex, unnecessarily complex, and that really is that final note that the tradition leaves off of. Now, to be fair, a lot of these icons in Mistra are phenomenal because they're actually developing parts of the Hesychast tradition, but they're also developing some of the colorist, how painters use color that developed at this period as well. In icon painting, we have this idea of reverse shading and temperature shift, and this is not the place to get into that, but a lot of the wonderful things we do in color and icon painting is really being experimented at this time, and it's part of this hesychasm, this theorizing about spiritual experience that is influencing this art. So there are aspects that are very wonderful, but there are also aspects that make this art a bit challenging, a bit tragic. Tragic is the right word. So that is the last stage of classical Byzantine art history, and to kind of give the larger overview, to kind of put everything into context. We have that beginning of sacred art and that rapid expansion that happens with imperial patronage, where emperors are sponsoring or patronizing the art, and this whole ceremonial, this whole aesthetic of the court is being imported into Eastern or into Christian art in general. But as we move into something that's more centered in Constantinople, more integrated with Byzantine liturgy and Byzantine spirituality, we have in that Middle Byzantine period the formation of what is the standard or classical form of our artistic tradition. And in this late period, we have the refinement of that tradition. To this day, when we look at the normal quote-unquote icons of our church, invariably they're drawing on these Paleologian motifs, these Paleologian compositions, and because it's at this point that just in terms of design, the icon reaches kind of the pinnacle of its experience. And after this point, it does decline, interestingly. So we will cover that in our next lecture. But if we wanted to kind of give sort of the leitmotif of this period, it really is that idea of refinement.